Good morning, everybody, and can I welcome everybody to the 20th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2014. Can I remind all those present that electronic devices, and particularly mobile phones, should be switched off because they do interfere with the sound system. Apologies have been received this morning from Claire Adamson, and I welcome Joan McAlpine for the second week in a row, but substituting for Joan, substituting for Claire this morning. So thanks very much for coming along, Joan. And we've got a note from Liam, whose transport has been slightly disrupted, but we believe he's on his way and will be here soon. And we've got apologies from Mary Scanlon as well. The first item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Public Appointments and Public Bodies, etc. Scotland Act 2003, treatment of the convener of the School Closure Review Panels as Specified Authority, Order 2014. Can I welcome Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, and his supporting officials from the Scottish Government. After we have taken evidence on the instrument, we will of course debate the motion in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and officials are of course, as I'm sure they're aware, not permitted to contribute to the formal debate. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener. This instrument is required in preparation for the appointment of the Convener of the School Closure Review Panels. At present, school closure proposals have been called in and determined by Scottish ministers in terms of the Schools Consultation Scotland Act 2010, Section 16. Amendments to the Schools Consultation Scotland Act 2010, made by the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014, will change that process by referring school closure proposals called in by Scottish ministers to the convener of the School Closure Review Panels. The convener is a public appointment, and one of their key roles will be to appoint a pool of people to be panel members and to select 3 members to form a school closure review panel to determine each case which is referred to the convener. Although other amendments to Schools Consultation Scotland Act 2010 came into force on the 1st of August 2014, the provisions to establish the functions of the convener of the school closure review panels and the panels themselves are not due to be brought into force until March 2015, as these require more preparation in relation to appointments and training of panel members. It's desirable for this order to come into force before the process of appointing the convener begins, in order that the appointment process is regulated by the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland, and in order that the process can comply with the Code of Practice prepared and published by the Commissioner under Section 2 of the Public Appointments and Public Bodies, etc. Scotland Act 2003. Regulations making provision for or about the eligibility for and disqualification from appointment as convener and as panel members, their tenure, removal from office, and the payment of salary, fees and allowances in terms of paragraphs 1, 9 and 2.5 of New Schedule 2A to the 2010 Act are to be made and laid in Parliament in early October 2014, prior to the date of the publication of the advertisement for the convener's post, with a commencement order being laid in Parliament in November 2014, which would commence the relevant provisions in the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014 on the appointment of the convener and panels, as well as various other provisions, in January 2015. We aim, therefore, to complete the appointments process and the necessary training and preparation to allow the convener and the school closure review panels to be in place and take up their functions from March 2015.
Thank you much. Cabinet Secretary, do any members have any questions? Neil.
Thanks. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I just wanted to ask you, what will happen if you do not like the decision made by the review body?
Well, it will be a decision that is final. That's why we've got this here. There are many things in the world that people don't like. There is a legal process, and the legal process we're putting in place will lead to a proper and, I think, justifiable set of decisions taken in the most transparent manner possible.
Thank you. Any other members wish to ask any questions at this point? Okay, we now move on, therefore, to the formal debate on the instrument, which is item 2. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion?
I think I've made as much of this as I possibly can, and given you the detail that I have, I'd just move the motion.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Any contributions from members? Nope. I don't suppose you want to respond to that then, Cabinet Secretary?
I'm not even tempted.
Thank you very much. Then we therefore have the question, which is that motion S4M 10645 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, I know you were staying with us. Is there a change in, Cabinet Secretary, is there a change in your officials for this?
There is a change in my officials. I'm sorry. I was just saying that I wondered if Janet's journey was strictly necessary, but I'm very glad that she was here. Thank you. Can we just change officials?
I will just suspend briefly while you change officials then. Our next item is to take evidence on the Lanarkshire Colleges Order 2014. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his continued presence, and can I also welcome the officials for this particular item. Again, after we're taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on this item, we will have a debate in the motion in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and I can confirm that again that officials will not be permitted to contribute to the formal debate. Can I welcome Liam MacArthur to the committee this morning? I know your transport rather held you up, but I'm glad you've made it. And can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some opening remarks?
Convener, this draft order is one of a series of orders that put in place the new regional structure for colleges, part of the implementation of the Post-16 Education Scotland Act 2013. This new structure will support colleges to be more responsive to the needs of learners and employers, to improve the life chances of our young people, to support Scotland's economic ambitions, and to create a more sustainable and secure system. As the committee is aware, there are 13 college regions, each of which is to have a single body responsible for regional outcomes. Orders have already been made for 12. This order would put in place arrangements for the final college region, Lanarkshire. Lanarkshire is one of only 3 regions with more than one college. In each of these regions, a regional strategic body will plan and distribute funding on a regional basis. The order would see Lanarkshire uniquely with a regional strategic body that is a college, New College Lanarkshire. Having listened carefully to the sector, I am persuaded that this arrangement will best deliver for learners and businesses in Lanarkshire. This is the regional structure both colleges in the region want. This is not my solution, it's their solution. But it's one I'm pleased to endorse, and it's a Lanarkshire solution made in Lanarkshire. In addition to making New College Lanarkshire the regional strategic body, the order does a number of things that flow from this. It assigns the other college in the region, South Lanarkshire College, to the regional strategic body. And speaking of South Lanarkshire College, I look forward later this month to cutting the first sod in their new state-of-the-art £2.1 million teaching block. That's the latest in a long line of investments we've made in college estates and in Lanarkshire. The order makes New College Lanarkshire a regional college. Being both a regional strategic body and a regional college means that New College Lanarkshire will have regional functions in relation to the 2 colleges in the region. It broadens the membership of the board of New College Lanarkshire to include members from South Lanarkshire College in recognition of its new responsibilities. And finally, it removes the entry in legislation to the regional board for Lanarkshire colleges, a body that, of course, hasn't come into being. I mentioned earlier that I've been persuaded of the case for New College Lanarkshire taking on regional responsibility. So let me, Convener, if I might, touch on how my thinking has evolved as the plans have changed as a result of changed circumstances, and to deliver the structure the colleges in the region actually want. We'd initially planned to establish a regional board. That's a particular type of regional strategic body which is a standalone organisation. When this bill was introduced, there were to be 4 colleges in the region. When it was passed, there were to be 3. However, by the time it has come round to consulting on assigning colleges, there were to be only 2. Given these changes, it would have been remiss not to consult on whether a regional board remained the optimal structure for the region. After careful deliberation, the colleges in the region have ultimately recommended that making New College Lanarkshire a regional strategic body instead. Now, I want to put on record my appreciation of the work of all concerned in the 2 colleges and beyond, including and especially the region's presumptive chair, the patient and tireless Linda McTavish, in developing the plans for Lanarkshire, plans that avoid creating a new standalone public body. The arrangements require close partnership working with New College Lanarkshire and South Lanarkshire College. They call on Stuart McKillop, the principal of South Lanarkshire College, and Martin Maguire, the principal of New College, to work particularly closely together, and I'm sure they will, because these plans are very much the product of their thinking and cooperation, and I have every confidence in the colleges and those principals. So I'd be pleased to answer any questions that the committee have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Before I throw it out to members for any questions they may have, can I raise one point that I noticed in the policy note that accompanies the order at paragraph 11? It talks about ministers making a separate order. And basically what it seems to be suggesting is that the South Lanarkshire College will remain eligible in principle for funding from the Scottish Further and Higher Education Funding Council until it's satisfied that the new arrangements are working well. I'm not aware that took place elsewhere. Could you give us some background as to why that particular...
There can only be one fundable body within a region. That is the regional strategic body. We presently will have 2 fundable bodies, and we want to move to one. But I think it's right that we do so once we make sure that the funding arrangement is working well. At the heart of this is a new structure which requires the money to be routed through the new regional college to another college. Both principals are quite confident in that. We're all confident in that. The Funding Council need to know by law that it's working well. So we will bring forward a proposal to remove South Lanarkshire College as a fundable body, but we want to be assured, the Funding Council needs to be assured, in actual fact, that it is working properly. So that's the arrangement we're taking.
Okay. Thank you very much. Neil.
I've also got a question about the policy note. In paragraph 17 it says, overall, no consensus emerged from the consultation about the type of regional strategic body in Lanarkshire. Can I ask what the issues were in the consultation? What was the pattern of response that led to there being no overall consensus?
Perhaps Colbert would answer that.
Yes, Minister. At the time, the colleges were looking at this proposal and needed more time to understand the implications of what it would be for New College Lanarkshire to be another regional strategic body rather than for to be a regional body. So at the time, the colleges had identified issues such as a conflict of interest that might arise because of the dual function of New College Lanarkshire and other issues along those lines. So when South Lanarkshire College responded to the consultation, they had expressed those concerns. Those were the concerns that the colleges themselves worked through to deliver the solution of the proposal that's now in the draft order.
Okay, thank you. Any other members got any questions at this stage? No? Okay, thank you. Moving on to the formal debate on the instrument, which is item 4 on our agenda. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion?
Can I just very briefly quote the two principals who I think deserve to be quoted in this matter? Mark Maguire, the Principal of New College Lanarkshire, says that he supports the proposed governance model for Lanarkshire, believes it will provide a more streamlined, cost-effective arrangement that will remove unnecessary bureaucracy whilst improving effectiveness. And Stuart McKillop, the Principal of South Lanarkshire College, says that South Lanarkshire College is supportive of the proposed structure to deliver college provision across the Lanarkshire region. These arrangements will deliver the best possible educational outcomes for the students within the region. He went on to comment regarding the fact that I had made a commitment that I wouldn't force a merger, and he felt that I had been true to my word on that. This is a solution developed by the colleges. As Colbert has said, they've worked through the issues very, very thoroughly, and I commend the work that has been done, and I'm very pleased to move the motion in my name.
Any contributions from members at this stage? No? No response required. Cabinet Secretary, I presume. Okay, can I put the question, therefore, that motion S4M 10643 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? We're agreed, yes, thank you very much. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their attendance, and can I suspend briefly?
Thank you.
The next item today is to continue our follow-up from the inquiry into decision-making on whether to take children into care. We published a report almost a year ago, and it gave a clear commitment to return to the issues so that we can understand the progress that we hope is being made. Can I welcome to committee this morning David Blair, who is head of the Looked After Children Unit at the Scottish Government, Last week, Mr Blair, you will have heard, of course, that we heard from very moving evidence, in fact, from young people who had been through the care system and, of course, their experiences. And we also heard from Who Cares Scotland. I think those young people had quite a lot to cope with, and some of the evidence we received obviously was very shocking in its nature, and their experiences, I think, very emotionally scarring to them, I'm sure, and their friends and family. Obviously, those were the very reasons that we wanted to embark on the inquiry in the first place, and to ensure that such care experiences improve in the future. I think all committee members were very moved by the evidence we received last week, and of course the evidence we received during our inquiry. Today, of course, is an opportunity for members to raise issues with the Scottish Government, and we hopefully want to focus on the issues, the questions rather, that we put to the Government and the responses we have received thus far, and obviously all of the material that we published as part of our report into our inquiry. I'm going to invite now members to indicate what questions they wish to start off with, but I know that Colin, you have a question, so we'll start with Colin.
Shall I just start with the question?
Oh, sorry, I apologise. Sorry, David, did you want an opening statement?
I do have one.
You do have one.
Helpful.
Sorry, I apologise. Yes. Well, okay then.
Wouldn't want to presume.
No.
Good morning, by the way. This is only 3 minutes worth, by the way. Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government's priorities are threefold. Intervening earlier and more effectively, building on the assets within families to prevent children becoming looked after where possible, securing earlier permanence by reducing long-term supervision, and enhancing the quality of care through corporate parenting for those who need it, including a planned and supported transition to independence at a time that is right for each young person. There are 4 aspects to our approach: child-centred thinking and listening to what young people say, encouraging collaborative effort, gathering and using evidence, and empowering those at the front line. Through our approach, all attention is focused on the changes close to each child, and not the system itself. The cumulative effect of each small improvement leads to a better system. For families on the edge of care, we are introducing a comprehensive framework towards enshrining early intervention, particularly for those who want help. This is through the Children and Young People Act GIRFEC provisions, Part 5 Children's Service Planning, Part 12 Services for Families with a Child at Risk of Becoming Looked After, and our Joint Strategic Commissioning Programme. On early permanence, we intend to mandate the permanence tracking of all looked after children, spreading important learning from our Permanence and Care Excellence Programme. And we will put pressure on reducing long-term supervision in favour of secure legal permanence like adoption, permanence and kinship care orders, and sustainable home returns. Turning to the role of data, we monitor overall progress through our national statistics, mainly the children looked after statistics and those from other public bodies. And throughout the activities I've mentioned, PACE and the Joint Strategic Commissioning Programme, high quality data is systematically collected for use within each project. At a national level, we are actively exploring building a national permanence data set, and we intend to publish a wider data strategy shortly. And finally, in corporate parenting, recognising the importance of strong, positive relationships to young people, we are taking forward our national mentoring programme. This will work with the grain of the Children and Young People Act measures and act as a significant step towards further participation of care experienced young people. Our experience passing the continuing care measures in the Children and Young People Bill as it was taught us that we need to do things collaboratively and with young people at the table. In that regard, we're working with Who Cares and its care experienced young people on an enhanced corporate parenting training programme to make sure corporate parents are ready for the new Act next year. And we have asked Celsus to lead on the guidance writing. In summary, we have a very full and ambitious agenda. Our programmes reflect the change that is required in the care system, and these are drawn from the evidence of underlying needs, and the committee has played a role in clarifying what those needs are. I hope that brief summary was helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, David, and I apologise for forgetting that you had an opening statement. I did have it written down, I just never read my own notes. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. I've got a couple of points I'd like to bring up. The first is in relation to legal representation at children's hearings, which is a constant refrain we've heard brought up. And most recently in the recent submission by Social Work Scotland, page 25, paragraph 4.1, concerns been expressed that most frequently parents are represented by the legal representatives at children's hearings, and that legal arguments to and fro can dominate these children's hearings. Now, the people that are running these hearings are not necessarily legally trained, nor, as I understand it, the way the children's hearings were structured, was it intended to be a courtroom. The result is that comment has been made that in many cases the interests of the child are somewhat ignored or forgotten in the exchanges with the lawyers. And given that GIRFEC quite rightly wants to put the child at the centre of everything and decisions on the child at the centre of everything, how can this be managed? How can this be made more effective?
I think there are a number of ways that you could answer that question. I think GIRFEC will have an important role to play, and I think we have to give it time to bed in. I think that touching on something that Ashley Cameron has referred to is the need to have a trusted adult in the life of every care experienced young person, and I think that's sometimes missing when hearings are called. You will have heard the stories as well as I have of children and young people who appear at panels where it's a room largely full of strangers, and I think that creates a difficult environment for young people to express themselves in a positive way. I think what often can come out is the views of the young person from a point of view of fear and rejection of a system they don't understand. I suppose that's part of the motivation why we wanted to introduce the national mentoring scheme. It's one possible contribution towards addressing that problem of not every young person having a trusted, positive adult role model, someone they can turn to, someone who they trust to advocate for them. I don't want to overplay that, but it's an important aspect. I think the other thing with the children's hearing system is it is a relatively newly reformed system. There is now a multi-agency programme board working to a clear blueprint, and a formal review of the legislation is expected in spring 2015, and that's the mechanism by which we'll ensure that the system is suitable for young people, but we would encourage young people to take part in that.
I hear what you say. Are we just relying on GIRFEC itself, in effect, to remedy this, because everybody supposedly will be focused on the child? Because we're also hearing in past meetings that members who are present, and I'm talking members of the children's hearing that are present, and social workers feel to some extent intimidated by the fact that there is this legal representation, and not having that background themselves, they have no way really to discuss, debate, or refute any of the points that are being made. The danger is apparently that it descends into an argument between two lawyers who are really representing, in many cases, two different parents, and the child is someplace there in the middle. Will GIRFEC itself be capable of handling that?
I think GIRFEC has a role to play along with a number of different things. I think it says a lot that we are open to continuing to evolve the children's hearing system. I don't think it's ever going to reach a steady state, but I think the fact that we have a multi-agency programme board looking at how we can better improve it is the mechanism by which we would evolve that system. There is a natural tension between the welfare-based principle and the rights-based agenda. It's not an unmanageable one, but it's one that we need to be vigilant about, and I think the occasional review, such as through this programme board, is an opportunity to do just that.
I think it's clear more work needs to be done on that particular aspect, though, to ensure that the child is kept at the very centre of what's happening at the children's hearing. Just to move on to my second point, the
children's hearing one. I have members who want to do supplementaries on the children's hearing.
Yes.
Liam?
Very briefly, I think Colin's very accurately set out some of the concerns that were put to us during the inquiry about the creating a kind of courtroom atmosphere out of the hearing system. However, I think it wasn't clear to me, even after the inquiry that we undertook, the extent to which hearing panels weren't following the advice of social work, to what extent we had a kind of mismatch between social work's expertise and judgment and advice, and the decisions being reached by panels. Is there anything that, any kind of evidence that, or data that you could draw on that maybe suggests the extent to which that there may be a mismatch, that panels may be opting to not follow in whole or in part the advice being led by social work?
We don't collect data nationally on that particular issue and on a number of other issues. I think we, as I remember the last time we gave evidence, the Children's Hearings Act was too new to really report on. There were a lot of changes and the system was in flux. One of the things that has really only recently come about is the existence of the Children's Hearings Scotland organisation, and I think that's probably the best answer to your question, is that they will be better placed than the system in the past to be able to monitor that dynamic, that issue.
I mean, I know drawing parallels between what I see locally and any kind of national picture is fraught with difficulties, but it appears to me that where decisions are perhaps being either overturned or at least questioned often arises when decisions are taken before the sheriff, rather than necessarily by the children hearing panel themselves. And I just wonder whether what we're getting is a conflating of two different dynamics within the process.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure. Are you suggesting that the sort of courtroom approach is working its way into the hearing system? Is that?
Well, no. That one would have thought that if the concern that social workers have, that in a sense panel members are inclined to be influenced unduly by representations from those representing parents, solicitors representing parents, then that would be reflected in panels either going against the recommendations of social work. And I'm not sure whether we've seen a pattern of that happening, and whether what is more likely is that when decisions from hearings come before a sheriff, that it's at that point that those decisions are either overturned or that that questions are asked of decisions that have been taken.
I think there are a number of different ways that you could probably answer that question. I think the social work profession has, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of the social work profession, I should say, but I know there are a number of concerns about social work being marginalised in the decision-making process, that recommendations are not necessarily adhered to or agreed with. I think that has to come down to how the system works. I think the system we have to have the trust in the system as a new system to run it in. I think we have to invest in the improvement agenda with the new programme board that's looking at the system. It is only really a year old in its current form, and CHS has a very strong role to play in ensuring that panel decisions are adhered to. I think that's really all I'd want to say on the subject.
Colin.
The other point I wanted to discuss really was data collection. The committee's report called on the Scottish Government as a matter of priority to collect more detailed data, and I quote that we provide a fuller picture of looked after children's outcomes and allow for judgment to be made on whether interventions have been successful, end of quote. Now, the response was that the Scottish Government has undertaken a data review for looked after children, confirming that the data we currently collect is lacking. And the obvious question is, and what's happening?
The review we did was prompted by the work of the committee. When we last gave evidence, our ambition was somewhat similar to the committee's, in the sense that we wanted to see what we could link up in terms of the national data sets across government. To put it in summary, what we discovered was that the linking is considerably more complicated than we thought. Part of the reason for that is the way that historically data sets have been crafted by different public bodies over many, many years. Some are more narrative, some are more quantitative. It's a very difficult task, and that's why we put it into our wider data strategy. We think that that's going to have to take, it's going to require necessarily a long time, and we're going to have to just commit to the graft to make that happen. What we've done is prioritise the bit that's most important to us in terms of our agenda, and that's the permanence agenda. And that's why we're meeting later in the month with a number of relevant public bodies to talk about creating a national permanence data set so that we can track the whole permanence process at a national level. And that would be, the aim of that is to be able to have a kind of a barometer of the health of the permanent bit of the care system, because it's such a good proxy for a number of other things in terms of reform. It's worth pointing out, I mean, national data is one thing, but it's really, really important if you're driving a reform agenda that you collect really good quality local data. And so through the PACE programme, which you've heard a little bit about, data is collected, high quality data on each of the changes as the programme evolves. That data is fundamental to the local changes and to determining what improvement is being achieved. And also through the Joint Strategic Commissioning programme, there is a part of that programme is about collecting very high quality data across the whole of a local area, and the idea being to reverse engineer the medium term services that you need in your children's services, and that's done. That data is very high quality as well. So there are a number of different strands to our data approach, which have evolved from the initial discussions we had with the committee, which go beyond just the Scottish Government leading the effort.
What sort of timescales on this?
On the permanence data set, I think a lot of it will come down to what our partners say is achievable, and I think this is a step that we perhaps didn't invest enough time in before. We'll happy to write back to you on what comes out of that meeting, if that's helpful. On the Joint Strategic Commissioning and PACE, those programmes are respectively just about to start and have started. So there is data already being collected in 2 local authority areas in PACE. We're about to expand that as we go around the country, and we have a timescale for allowing every local authority to take part, should they wish, of about 3 years, which we think is a reasonable sort of timescale. If we can do it faster, we will. On Joint Strategic Commissioning, it's a very, very intensive data collection exercise, but it's very, very high quality and only needs to be done every now and then. That programme is just signed off, and that will be starting with 3 local authority areas this autumn when the schools go back.
It sounds like you're in the very early stages of putting in place the capability to gather together all the data that's needed. It's a very important area, as the committee has highlighted. I wonder, Convener, if we could ask maybe for the Scottish Government to come back to us as this proceeds, and so that we're aware of what's happening.
Yep. I think that's not unreasonable, David, given the priority the committee gave it in our evidence taking. Just to follow up from what Colin said, I'm going to bring Neil in a moment, but just a question from myself. I don't mean to be awkward, but unfortunately for you, it's in my nature. And we did say in our inquiry that we felt that this was a matter of priority. And what I've read in your response, your written response, and what you've said today, are a lot of nice phrases about things like you're going to meet to discuss data collection, you're working hard to think about it, you're strategizing about it, lots of stuff is going to happen at some point in the future. We felt this was a matter of priority. It's a year, give or take a week or two, since we published our report. Is that a priority for the government, given the time that has already passed and what you've just said?
It is, and I think it's worth just clarifying where we've invested our time and effort, because since the committee last time, we hadn't started PACE, we hadn't started Joint Strategic Commissioning, and we had not conducted the review that we had. I need to sort of emphasise a bit the complexity of the task of joining up data nationally, and also reflect on the fact that the Scottish Government's role, as we see it, is very much one of supporting the ground to be able to improve their own systems in situ. And that's why we've invested our time in those 2 change programmes. They're comprehensive change programmes that will make a massive difference in a relatively short space of time. It does take time to set up those programmes, and the data that will come from those programmes is something that can be shared with other bodies locally to improve their permanence systems. So we think it's been time well spent to invest in those programmes, because fundamentally what matters is that decision makers locally have the right data to improve their systems, and that is something that is fundamentally missing from social work planning when it comes to things like the care system.
Neil.
In the Minister's submission to the committee, it said we've seen some signs of improvements for looked after children, and leading on from the issues around data, I wanted to ask you about the education outcomes for looked after children statistics, which show a drop in attainment tariff scores and the percentage of looked after children in positive destinations from 2011-12 to 2012-13. Now, I accept and acknowledge that they've increased from the figures that were there in 2009-10, but in attainment tariff scores, they've increased every year from 2009-10 to 2012-13 for children who aren't looked after, and the same increase in positive destinations for non-looked after children have increased every year. But in 2011-12, the attainment score for looked after children was 106. It fell to 86 in 2012-13, and the percentage of looked after children going to positive destinations was 75% in 2011-12 and is 71% in 2012-13. I acknowledge that that is an increase from 2009-10, but the most recent statistics for the 2 years that we have show a decrease. So that cannot be, viewed as an improvement over the last year that we have statistics for. Have you got an explanation from the government as to why that is? Why is that decrease from 2011-12, 2012-13, and at the same time there's an increase in non-looked after children as well?
You're absolutely right to point out that there's been a steady increase in a number of those criteria in terms of tariff scores, attendance and exclusion over a number of years, and then there is what looks like a dip in the last year. We've asked our analytical colleagues for that for some advice on that. It doesn't entirely chime with our sense of how things are moving, and we think there might have been a statistical aspect to the blip. What we published was the second year of the 2-year collection cycle, and what we said when we published the previous years. If you look into the children looked after statistics. The educational statistics, we cautioned that because that was the first year of the 2-year collection cycle, it might have exaggerated the figures, and it looks like that could have happened based on the figures that we got this year. The sample size in the 2-year samples is twice that of the previous collection, and we think that's possibly ironed out the vagaries that you might get from a lower sample size. So we're not convinced yet that the statistics are detecting an underlying change. We would want to run it for another couple of years. Certainly, we'd want the next one to see whether, in fact, there was a blip. So, in effect, the previous one was perhaps too high. We don't actually know. We're checking into that.
And if it was a blip, why is there any reason why the a blip over 1 year, why it's not in keeping with the increase for non-looked after children in the same year?
The sample size for non-looked after children is vast. I mean, it's statistically valid in every way. For looked after children, the numbers are in the small hundreds, and that's one of the problems we have, is that we've moved from an annual sampling to a 2-year sampling. So we need to really run this one for a bit longer. That's really all I have to say.
I think obviously it draws the importance of collecting data, analysing data, and having that as quickly as possible. I mean, I hear what you're saying, we'll need to wait till next year to see if that was a blip, but as the convener has said, the convener was right to point out that, this issue, analysing data, is of importance for the committee, and we want to see how effective these strategies are, and obviously it is concerning, these statistics over the last year, granted that there's been an increase since 2009.
Thank you. I think it would have been helpful, David, had the government pointed out some of these things in its written response, put some caveats around these numbers, because many of us were puzzled by that blip, if that's what we're calling it, if it is a blip or it's an actual trend in the wrong direction. So I think it would have been helpful if that had been included. Then many of us wouldn't have spent the last 2 weeks puzzling as to why that had happened. But I suspect you may well be right in terms of sample size and the anomaly that it may have created. But it would have been helpful had that been included. Gordon MacDonald.
Morning, David. I want to talk on the subject of independent advocacy. In your opening statement, you mentioned the importance of child-centred thinking and listening to what children say. And in the Scottish Government's written evidence, it made a commitment to increase the quality, consistency and availability of advocacy support for all children and young people, including looked after children. What steps are the government taking to meet this commitment?
I suppose it's worth referring to what was said in the Minister's letter. We published the Independent Advocacy Guide for Commissioners, including principles and standards for independent advocacy, in December, and in June this year we supplemented this with an online resource on our website offering guidance for anyone who advocates for children and young people. You'll be aware we've yet to commend Section 122 of the Children's Hearing Scotland Act 2011, which relates to advocacy, access to advocacy services for children attending the children's hearings system. Officials have undertaken detailed discussions with relevant partners to scope out a range of models and consider possible future options for advocacy services for children in the modernised children's hearing system. We'll commend Section 122 when we're satisfied that new services can be suitably designed and sustainably resourced for the young people within the hearing system that want and need this provision. There are a number of other circumstances where advocacy is available in terms of mental health legislation and also educational additional support for learning legislation. One of the things that we're doing to try and advance the agenda is through the National Mentoring Programme. We think we see advocacy as a sort of spectrum of provision, of a spectrum of participation. If you go from sort of the sort of parenting approach on one side to a young person being able to fully advocate for themselves on the other side, you've got advocacy, independent advocacy in there at the kind of sharp end, but you also have a much broader, sort of shallower need for young people to have a trusted adult in their life, and we think that it's worth investing in that in the first instance, because there's a sort of analogy about if you do that bit, you're investing sort of early and effectively, and then you set up a system to introduce a more comprehensive independent advocacy element to that. So our plan is sort of multi-layered and staged, but that's where we're focusing our effort at the moment.
Yeah, last week the young people who spoke highlighted a number of comments about getting their voices heard. They said that decisions were being made about their life. I was not included in decisions, rather they were made about me. Decisions are not at the heart, they were not at the heart of the decision-making process. How confident are you that the range of models you spoke about are going to ensure that children's voices are heard? And is it the intention of the government to at least provide as a minimum standard a trusted adult or advocate for all looked after children?
The short answer to your question is yes, in principle. And through the National Mentoring Scheme, we think that can play a big role in fulfilling some of that unmet need. And I think it's important to say some. It's an important programme. We're starting with children looked after at home who have the least contact with professionals in their life. We're starting with a particular age group who have reported sensitivities to us about attending hearings, so that's your 8 to 14-year-olds. So that's the group we're starting with the National Mentoring programme. And then I think it's worth, in the background to that, you have Getting It Right for Every Child. And I think if wind forward a few years, you would expect to see professionals being much more able to help a young person to express their views. I think in the context of that, we would be looking to bolster our independent advocacy offering to young people. And those things, have a timeline.
Who Cares Scotland, in their evidence last week, said that they have access to only 15% of the looked after and care experienced young people in this country. What proportion of looked after children across the 32 local authorities have access to independent advocacy at the present moment?
I don't know. There's a legal duty to hear the voice of the young person. It's well understood that local authorities should have some access made available to young people in their area when required, but it is a matter for local authorities to plan that.
Is that information available, or is it?
Not through national statistics, but it's something that can be found out.
Right. So, given that we're intending to expand the National Mentoring Scheme and provide trusted adult in a form of advocacy, is there any estimates on the number of training places required to provide the number of trusted adults, etc., that would be required, and what resources would be needed in order to fulfil that obligation?
We're investing in the design of the scheme carefully, and we've just appointed a professional advisor to help us scope that, in fact, all those aspects, because we are... one of the things we're very alert to is the idea that there are lots of small-scale schemes, good schemes, around the country over many years, and they fall foul of... they run for a couple of years, the funding runs out, or they run for a couple of years and the funder changes their criteria, and you have to change your model, and you lose... the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. What we're trying to do is overcome all those things with consistent national funding and standards through the National Mentoring Programme, but through local organisations, community-based organisations, and that's drawn from the comments we've received throughout this process and from the likes of Who Cares. All of that needs to be scoped. It's a very, very ambitious programme, but yes, we're committed to doing that, and we're happy to keep the committee informed as we go.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Gordon. You said, David, that quite rightly, there's a legal right for that a children's voice must be heard in this process. How do you know if a local authority is meeting that right?
We don't collect statistics on that in the same way that we don't collect statistics on every duty that apply to local authorities. Some information was collected through the work I mentioned in the Minister's letter, through the advocacy strategy. We haven't collected anything recently, but it's something we would want to do through setting up the mentoring programme to make sure that we were matching the scheme dynamic to what the need was out in the field.
The indication, if you like, or the view of some that we've heard from is that that legal right that children now have to be heard is not being met by some local authorities. Now, if that's the case, surely it's the duty of the government to find out which local authorities are not meeting that legal duty and deal with that particular situation, is it not?
I think it's the role of the government to set the framework and create the expectations.
I don't want to interrupt, but if it's a legal duty that the children's voice must be heard, how is that monitored?
It's monitored in the normal course of things through the inspection framework. It should be, and it is a component part of the inspection system, that advocacy systems are tested in some way. So we have the normal system to check on that. I've heard representation from the care sector that advocacy is under. Independent advocacy is not consistent across the whole country. In some cases, there are. It's been put to me that at least one local authority has no advocacy. It is something that concerns us. It would concern us if there was a legal duty that wasn't being met. We would expect the inspection system to pick that up, but I think our answer to that is to try and improve the system. And I think that the range of activities I've outlined in terms of getting it right for every child and the National Mentoring Programme are a big step in the right direction. There is a tension, locally with local authorities who provide their own advocacy service and are also responsible for funding the services to a young person. And I think that's part of what we're trying to resolve with the National Mentoring Programme, is to move the dynamic towards a national funding model, so that tension is removed and you can have a more comprehensive trusted, positive adult role model in the life of as many children as possible, and in principle, all children in care and possibly beyond. That's a longer term aspect. So there are a number of problems with the system. There is, going by testimony from a number of bodies, a deficit in the sector, but we also have a positive and meaningful programme of work to try and improve it.
It was put to us, the reason I asked the question is it put to us as well as a committee that one authority, I mean other authorities may be doing better than others, and I'm sure there's a range of services available, but one authority has no advocacy service. You said the same statement had been put to you in your role.
Probably by the same person.
Possibly by the same person. What did you do to investigate that?
We haven't investigated that just now, but that's part of the work that I want our professional advisor to take on when they start in a few weeks' time, when they're designing the National Mentoring Programme, because what we want them to do is link up with our colleagues in Children's Hearings who are looking at implementation of Section 122 and a few other and other policy areas where advocacy is a concern, and to bring together the thinking on advocacy and mentoring and that whole spectrum of participation. One of the first things they'll have to do is take stock of advocacy provision in the country, and I think it's best to put it in their hands. So that's, we're talking about a few weeks before that.
And will that information then be available to this committee?
We could, once we do a trawl, we can certainly pass that on, yes.
Liam MacArthur.
It's just following up the convener's line of questioning there. I mean, presumably the work that we've done will also look at the resources that have been allocated essentially for advocacy services. I mean, my understanding is that those in the context of Orkney, for example, look fairly modest, albeit that I don't think there's any complaint that in an Orkney context there isn't independent advocacy available, and indeed that the local authority isn't ensuring that is taken up or awareness is raised of it. So I would hope that forms part of the review that your expert's been taken on to carry out. Could I also ask that specific attention is given as part of that process to looking at the dynamics in smaller, particularly rural local authorities, where I think the opportunities for independent advocacy are going to be, I'll say, different. I think there may be greater challenges, but nevertheless, I think there's a particular dynamic there that can't simply be swept up in a kind of catch-all analysis of advocacy across the board, because I think the availability of some of those who provide services largely nationwide, I think you'll find that there are occasional blind spots, and many of those will be in island and rural authorities. So I mean, it's more a plea than a question that is taken up as a specific work stream within the work that your experts carrying out.
I think that's a perfectly fair point. It's a point that's been made before, and that's part of the reason why we didn't want to construct a completely sort of centralised scheme. What we wanted to do was centralise the bits that made sense, so the funding, the national standards, the quality assurance, the vetting of volunteer mentors, but then work through community-based organisations. So I think ideally, there will be a large number of community-based organisations in every part of the country, as the scheme rolls forward. So I'd hope that would be picked up.
And the point around funding and national standards is, again, would that be something where, for example, if funding is allocated on a per capita basis in relation to need, it doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that you have a baseline cost in order to establish a service that you just can't get away from. So unless you factor that in and then have a per capita funding allocation over and above that, you're likely to leave some areas with a pot of funding with which they can do very little.
I think, again, it's a very valid point. The scheme will have to reach a sort of critical mass of funding to make that, all stack up. But yes, we're receptive to arguments of that nature. But the funding would go to community advocacy and mentoring organisations. So we would work with those, existing organisations. But yes, that's a reasonable point we'll take on board.
Okay, thank you, Liam. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Last week, when we heard evidence from care experienced young people from Who Cares Scotland, many of them spoke about the importance of sibling contact, the need to have sibling contact and the difference that can make in young people's experiences, how that's managed, how that's provided, or how that's denied. In the course of the Children and Young People's Bill, there were proposals put forward to enable sibling contact, and they weren't successful, but there was comment at the time of that being dealt with through guidance. Can you give any clue as to what's happening about that guidance? What's the timescale for it? Has any progress been made about the development of that guidance?
I remember the proposals, and I remember the debate. The proposals didn't succeed partly because it wasn't clear how we would square the views and the rights of the siblings should contact not be in their interest. And that's not something that can't be resolved, but it seemed better to leave that in the hands of professionals to make that professional judgment than to make it a statutory function. The guidance is underway. We're working with a number of stakeholders on that. I'm happy to write to the committee actually on exactly where that is, if that's helpful. Yeah, okay.
Helpful, thank you. Thanks, Convener. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I raise a particular point that I'm interested in? We had, during your inquiry, we took evidence from parents with a learning disability and some of their representatives. And in our report, we pointed this out to the government, and we asked that further research is necessary to determine the true scale of the problem. We call on all parties to work together on this, believe the Scottish Government should evaluate the merits of the supported parenting approach, etc. Fill paragraph 84 in our report. Your response to that, the Scottish Government's response was that there was ongoing work to get it right for looked after disabled children and work to make hearings easier for those with special needs. Now, we weren't talking about disabled children. What we were talking about was parents with a learning disability and the huge variation in terms of the difference between a learning disability set of parents and their children being taken into care, which was, the figures were very high, and the rest of the community where the figures were very much lower. So can I ask again the question that we asked as part of the inquiry report as to what the government's doing about that particular aspect of the removal of children from parents with a learning disability and the merits of a supported parenting approach to try and prevent a situation where children are removed not because they are bad parents, but because they are parents that need support.
I think what's worth saying on this one is, I mean, the part of this comes down to the general message in the parenting strategy, and part of it comes down to good judgment by social workers to make reasonable decisions, and that parents with learning disabilities have appropriate access to appropriate representation in the relevant forums, whether it's the hearings or the court system. And you know, we're receptive to suggestions for improvement on that. Again, the Ministry Working Group on Child Protection and Disabilities, led by Norman Dunning, has now reported, I don't know if you're aware, we can send the committee some details about that, has developed a new set of training and resource materials, including good practice examples to help professionals better understand the issues associated with child protection and ensure services are best offer the best possible support for children affected by disability more generally. And the toolkit also contains national guidance for child protection in Scotland, additional notes for practitioners protecting disabled children from abuse and neglect. This, again, sort of, it's more tangential to your point, I appreciate, but it's all relevant in the broader context.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the broader context, but it was a specific question about parents who had a learning disability. Now, it seems to me it's not clear whether there has been any specific research undertaken on this issue, particularly on the issue, more widely, but also the specific question about the removal rates of children from vulnerable parents. And also, you did say, I think, in your response, that the Scottish Government has evaluated the merits of the supported parenting approach. What was the outcome of that evaluation?
I couldn't tell you, but I'm happy to write to you on that one.
If you could do that, and about the specific research that we've requested.
I'm not aware that research has been done, so I'm happy to write to you on that one as well.
Right. It was in the report that we published a year ago, that request.
Sorry, I don't have any information on that.
Okay. Well, I would appreciate if we get a written response, David, to these specific questions, if you don't mind. Okay. Thank you. George Adam.
Yes, thank you, Convener. During the inquiry, one of the things that came up was the fact that there was a problem with retention of social workers within the local authorities, and one of the problems they had was either good social workers being promoted and then taken away from the front line. And one of the things the young people also said to us was the fact that they found the difficulty from the point of view that they didn't have a continuation of the social work support during with the individual. Now, I know that it was mentioned during the report from last year, and I understand, because in your answer, the Scottish Government's answer, it says it is for the employers and practitioners to assess on a local basis the necessary roles, structures, levels of responsibility and accountability. I know it's the local authority that does it, but now where are we at this stage, trying to find a way to try and look at ways that we can, the Scottish Government can promote how we retain social workers within the profession, because a lot of them were actually leaving the profession and going elsewhere.
I think you've identified the right context, but in that context, the Scottish Government's role is to try and help and support and improve, and we do that through a number of bodies, including the SSSC. There is a review as part of the SSSC's work to develop a learning strategy for the social services workforce. This will include reviewing learning at all levels throughout a worker's career, both at qualifying and post-qualifying levels, and the support needed to achieve those skills and knowledge, and a report will be produced by March 2015. And also work is progressing on the review of the social work degree, which is an important element as well, with several different strands of work ongoing, including research on the readiness of practice of newly qualified social workers, visits to all 32 local authorities to gather evidence of the impact of degree and changes required, an online ideas platform being launched for all social workers to provide views on the degree, a review of the current standards in social work education as well. These are all things that we are working with the SSSC to help advance the issues that you mentioned. But as you say, it is a matter for local authorities.
But surely there's a way that apart from what you've already mentioned there, there's a way that the Scottish Government can lead and try and work with the local authorities to do, because as the convener's already mentioned, the report is about a year old, and we seem to be kind of moving quite slowly. I know it can be difficult with 32 authorities trying to get them all to sing from the one hymn sheet, and various areas have areas of excellence and others don't. You know, so is there anything else you can tell us at this stage where we've actually kind of taken on board and we're moving forward a wee bit?
I mean, aside from, I don't know if you were aware, but that Alan Baird, our Chief Social Work Advisor, is leading the Social Work Strategic Forum, which is looking into a number of different relevant aspects to the size and sort of shape of the social services workforce. And I think that's it's in its early days. It's met a number of times, but it does have a people workforce strand of work. And I think there's a web link I can send the committee to information coming out of that. But that would be probably the place to focus attention on what next.
Thanks for that.
Can I just, sorry about this, but I want to follow that up for just 1 second. You did say, and I want to quote, to make sure that the issues noted by the committee in regard to staffing levels, retention and training are considered and taken forward within the appropriate context. I have to be honest and say I didn't know what that meant. In terms of concrete progress, what does that statement mean?
Can you clarify what you mean by progress?
Well, I mean, you've said that you'll make sure that the issues noted by the committee in regard to staffing levels, retention and training are considered and taken forward within the appropriate contexts. I'm just quoting the government's letter. And what I want to know is what that actually means on the ground. What difference will that make? What are you actually doing in practical terms to respond to the committee's concerns about this area?
It goes back to the points I made before, which is recognising the Scottish Government's role. It is a local authority matter to plan social work services in terms of the numbers and experience required within their own structures. And what's suitable for one local authority is not necessarily suitable for another, maybe much larger local authority. Our role is to work in partnership with local government. And I think the forum that I mentioned, led by our Chief Social Work Advisor, is the key mechanism by which we'll be doing that.
How do you measure? So I'm struggling to understand how you measure how you improve things, because clearly I can understand that you may need different policies for different areas depending on how rural or urban a particular local authority is, or various other circumstances that differ between local authorities. What I'm trying to understand is what the government's role in this, apart from saying it's a matter for local authorities and we have a committee that looks at it. What in practical terms, do you do as a government to try and drive forward the kind of change that I think we both want?
I think it's probably moving beyond my expertise. This isn't an area I'm responsible for, but I'm happy to find out the answer to those questions and write back to the committee.
Thank you very much, Neil.
I just want to ask you about resources. Has the ongoing reforms, changes in legislation, guidance, work practices, etc., initiated by the Scottish Government, have they demonstrated a need for additional resources to be spent on children, looked after children? I use this as an example. We heard a lot of evidence from trade unions during the Children and Young People about the named person saying that it would only properly work if there was additional resources. Now, I use that as an example. I don't want to kind of get bogged down on just that policy, but have the ongoing reforms that the Scottish Government are pursuing demonstrated a need for additional resources?
The answer to your question is yes and no. I think with when we started our reform agenda on the care system, we were acutely aware that there was, the very constrained financial resources. When setting up, I'll give you examples from my area. When setting up the Permanent Care Excellence Programme, we did it on the basis that there was no pot of money handed to local authorities when we did it, because what we needed to do was engender a sense of change that could be achieved without more money being added to the pot. And actually, so far, the evidence suggests that actually it's very liberating not to have money handing over, but to provide support in a non-financial sense, so through consultancy, through data trolls, through a number of other different mechanisms. The sustainable legacy being that you leave a critical mass of skills and knowledge about how to do things better. So that's working, and that didn't require more resources, and what it's leading to is a more efficient permanence planning system, which means that young people are leaving care sooner to legal permanence. There are fewer children on long-term supervision as a result. So there are resource savings associated with a programme that we're operating which doesn't require handing over more money. Joint strategic commissioning is an order of magnitude more ambitious than that. Again, that's not about handing money to local authorities to invest in an innovative scheme or anything. It's about facilitating local change within the existing resource envelope and securing better outcomes through a re-engineered children's services. So we're very hopeful that both those things, which have very strong evidence behind them, can lead to fundamental change, release resources from freeing social workers in particular, but the whole system, from wasteful practice. There are other things where more resource will be required. I think the mentoring and advocacy side of things is something that is likely to need more resource, and we are putting more money in from central government to facilitate that.
In terms of resources, obviously we've been looking at the issue of how much is spent on looked after children, and you mentioned increasing resources. Figures from the Scottish Taoiseach Local Government Finance Statistics show that £750 million was spent on children's social work services in 2009-10, and in cash terms this has gone up to 824 million, or due to go up to 824 million estimated in 2014-15. It's gone up in cash terms, but in real terms that is actually a cut, I understand, of around £50 million when you take into account inflation. How does, obviously there are, I don't think anyone's in any doubt there are funding pressures at the moment for local authorities, but in terms of all the things we've talked about, in terms of workload management, social workers being able to support young people and children, outcomes for looked after children, and actually even issues around data collection and local authorities having the resources and time to provide that. What is the impact of the funding pressures and the real terms cuts do you think having on these range of indicators that we're looking at?
think the impact is demonstrated through the outcome statistics that you see. So where things have improved, that is in spite of a very difficult funding environment. But we don't collect, and I've said this point before, we don't collect statistics on all the detailed bits of the process. So I can't give you a kind of a line by line account of how changes in national funding affect the ground. That is a matter for local authorities, but it is something that we are absolutely committed to supporting and improving. And that's the Joint Strategic Commissioning Programme is, a very good example of how exactly we can mobilise our role to work with local partners, not just local authorities, but community planning partners more generally, to use the existing resource envelope to better effect. And we'll be happy to keep the committee informed of that programme.
Liam McArthur.
Following that up, in a sense, is there not a risk around expectation management here? That just intuitively, a child-centred approach would appear to be labour time intensive. You've talked about in relation to trusted adult and mentoring. I think the data collection that Neil Wibby was referring to, the convener's reference to some of the support required around perhaps parents with learning difficulties, even areas of greater collaboration between different partners and agencies within the system. Well, some efficiencies may come from that. I think overall there is just an inevitability about this being a process that will require greater levels of funding and able to make it work. And therefore, is there not a risk that in terms of setting expectations there as to what this is going to achieve, but funding levels falling some way short of that in different areas? The danger is we're back here in 5 years' time wondering why it didn't work, because the ideas themselves seemed to be the right ones for us to be pursuing.
I can see your point. I'm not sure I agree with it. I think the evidence from the Permanence and Care Excellence Programme would suggest that there is quite significant waste within the system. And by waste, I mean processes, activities that take up time and effort of social workers' time in particular, which add no value, which are the product of a custom that has been prevalent in a particular authority or a particular team within an authority for a decade or decades. And it's been very enlightening to see some of the changes that have been going on within our pilot areas, where simple things have released time, have meant that more time has been able to be spent on case file management rather than just servicing a bureaucracy. I don't think it necessarily follows that being child-centred, raises the implied cost of a system. I think based on the evidence we've seen, there is quite significant waste within the system that can be reallocated towards more productive ends. I think the Strategic Commissioning Programme itself is a good example of how, given the evidence that predates the programme and which justifies the programme, there is huge waste within the system in terms of things like the spot purchasing of residential care and foster care, and how quite a lot of resource could be reallocated through strategic commissioning towards other things that support young people in decision making. It's probably worth also saying that systems which don't take account of the child's view often make decisions which are not in the best interest of the child, which leads to a system where you have to compensate for that with other systems. And that's all waste. It's better to make a decision right at the first gasp of when it needs to be made. And in that sense, actually, the system has waste in it that could be removed if through the GIRFAC approach, which is, I think, what you're articulating.
I have to say that the notion that strategic commissioning and a centralised approach to some of these things doesn't lead to different types of waste and solutions being not necessarily tailored to localised need, I think ought to be taken into account. I think also is there not a question that perhaps the emphasis has been on what social workers and others within the system are required to do that is new, without necessarily emphasising what it is that they will no longer be required to do as a result of the changes. Because certainly the message we've had from those at the coalface is that they are already under considerable strain, and workload pressures are a real issue for them. But no sign really as yet to reflect what you've been talking about, that they are doing less of what they've done historically and are working more effectively and efficiently as a consequence.
No, I think that's a fair point in the sense that things like the strategic commissioning programme is really just about to start. But I think it's worth just clarifying it's not a centralised programme. It's a locally driven programme supported by Scottish Government through the Joint Improvement Team. But it starts with a very comprehensive survey of school children, and there is a very, very high quality data that comes from that. So it is all about working to understand the needs of each child in an area, and reverse engineering services within the local area to match that. So it's a very comprehensive way of getting to the point of how do we make services wrap around the needs of children. We can do it at the individual child level, we can do it at an aggregate as well, and both those things are valid in this context.
Thank you very much. Just one final question, David, if you don't mind. Obviously, this committee is very keen that we see improvement for looked after children and young people. The Scottish Government and other bodies have been working hard to achieve demonstrably better outcomes for those children and young people. Can I ask you to provide the committee with some concrete examples of that improvement and some sort of detailed description of what that improvement looks like, whether it's improvement that's already occurred or improvement that you expect to see in the near future? And can I make one request, that when you answer this question, that you don't talk about working groups, discussions, ongoing initiatives, but actual concrete examples which we can understand and can see on the ground will lead to better outcomes?
I'll be happy to start this answer now, but I think it might, I probably won't do it justice, so I'll be happy to follow up with the committee with something more detailed if that's helpful. There are a number of different programmes that we've run, which have evidence which lead to improvement. Necessarily, the care system is something which improvement takes a very long time. Outcomes historically are not great. We all recognise that. They have been gradually improving for a few years, not as fast as I think anyone would like. I mean, the most obvious example I can think of is the work we're doing in Aberdeen and in Renfrew in the PACE programme. It's only been running for a few months. Necessarily, it needs to run for about 5 or 6 months before you have enough data points in the chart. If any of you have been involved in the Early Years Collaborative, it is very much inspired by that approach, with a little bit more in terms of localised support to implement the method, and also we support those two areas with Celsus practice experts in legal issues and in hearings and in other areas. The work going on in those two areas has led to a number of small-scale changes, tests of change. I don't have a list of them here, and I'm happy to provide that. But those small-scale tests are things that local people have, the sort of practitioners locally have identified as things that really annoy them, that really get in the way of making effective decisions for young people, and that lead to drift and delay in the system. Now, the drift and delay argument has all been well researched by SCRA. You've all seen the report. So tackling that is a concrete thing that improves the system. Those projects are focused squarely on reducing drift and delay. The small-scale tests of change do that. What we've seen so far with both those areas is a dramatic change in the understanding of local practitioners. We've heard comments from practitioners saying that it's become a very liberating environment to be able to poke holes in an established concrete system and rework it to something which is fundamentally more fit for purpose. The evidence is about to be made public on those two areas, and probably the best thing to do would be to forward that on to the committee once those things go. We have a website which is about to be populated by the early evidence from those tests, but the evidence is very compelling, and it's done based on, as I said, from the Early Years Collaborative methodology. There's evidence collected at each test of change, so it pretty much answers your question, but I'll send on the evidence as soon as it's published.
Thank you very much for that, David, and can I thank you very much for attending this morning. I would like, if the committee is agreeable to, I know you're going to follow up a number of points in writing to us, and I'm sure we'll look forward to hearing from that, but it may well be, if the committee agrees, that might be something that we want to have regular updates on, given the amount of work this committee's undertaken over the last 2 and a bit years. So I'm sure that we would appreciate regular updates from the government, either instigated by ourselves or by yourselves. We're quite happy for you to write to us, even if we don't ask, but we may well ask in the near future.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our business for today. However, our next meeting will be on the 19th of August, and that meeting will be dealing with stage 2 of the merger bill, the merger between Royal Commission on Ancient Historic Monuments Scotland and Historic Scotland. And that will be our last meeting before the Parliament moves into recess before the referendum. Thank you very much for attending today, and I close the meeting.